A desperate man crossed a line that night. He cornered his own sister at a snowy train station, knocked her from her wheelchair, and silenced her loyal German shepherd with a brutal kick, forcing her to watch, helpless and terrified. What he didn't notice was the man sitting quietly a few steps away. No uniform, no badge, just another traveler holding a cup of cold coffee. But that stranger was a Navy SEAL, and when the system looks away, some men don't. Before we begin, please help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers. Your single click truly means more than you know. God bless you for keeping hope alive. Snow fell thick and steady over a small train station in rural Montana, muffling the world beneath low-hung Christmas lights and pressing the night into a quiet, breath-held stillness where even sound seemed reluctant to move. Ryan Walker sat alone on a narrow wooden bench beneath the station's shallow overhang, his gloved hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since lost its warmth. At 35, he carried himself with the unremarkable posture of a man who preferred to blend into the background, tall but not imposing, lean without fragility, shaped by discipline rather than comfort. His dark hair was cut short and uneven, as if done by his own hand, and rough stubble softened the sharp angles of his jaw. His muted gray-blue eyes moved slowly across the platform, not scanning in panic, but cataloging details with quiet precision, revealing a man who never fully relaxed, even in stillness. He was not running from his past, nor chasing it. He existed in the narrow space between assignments and expectations, between who he had been trained to be and who the world now assumed he was. Christmas made that space heavier, amplifying absence and memory, turning silence into something that pressed inward. He had chosen this bench deliberately, close enough to hear announcements, yet far enough to avoid conversation, wanting nothing more than a few minutes where time slowed and nothing was required of him but waiting. Across the platform, near a large potted pine sagging under fresh snow, sat a young woman in a wheelchair. Her name, Ryan would later learn, was Claire Walker, but for now she was simply a presence that drew his attention. She appeared to be in her late 20s, slender without fragility, her posture upright and as if refusing to surrender space to the chair. A thick red wool scarf stood out vividly against the snow, her chestnut brown hair slipping from beneath a knitted cap, brushing fair, lightly freckled skin. Her expression was calm and thoughtful, marked by quiet endurance rather than bitterness, as though loss had shaped her without breaking her. Beside her lay an old German shepherd named Bear, stretched out on the frozen ground with patient familiarity. Even in age he was large, broad-framed, though time had thinned his hind legs and dusted his muzzle with gray. His faded black and tan coat bore small scars, one ear upright while the other leaned slightly, giving him an attentive, intelligent look. Though calm, his body angled subtly outward, placing himself between Claire and the platform, not through training, but through instinctive loyalty earned over years of shared hardship. Claire watched him with a small, private smile, her gloved hand resting lightly on the arm of her wheelchair. This was their ritual, begun after the accident, after winter nights grew heavier than others. Each Christmas she brought Bear here not to travel, but to sit and watch the snow, reminding herself that some things still arrived on time and that the world held rhythms untouched by grief. She never looked at Ryan, yet his presence registered faintly. Another stranger waiting, another life briefly passing through her own. Ryan noticed them more than he intended. At first it was the dog. Dogs always caught his attention. In his world, they were partners and tools, creatures of command and control. But Bear carried no tension, no readiness to strike, only a deep, settled vigilance born of devotion. Watching the quiet understanding between the woman and her dog tightened something in Ryan's chest. Not sadness exactly, but a reminder of something he had long denied himself. The loudspeaker crackled with news of another delay, its metallic voice swallowed by falling snow as travelers sighed and pulled coats tighter. Claire glanced at the station clock, then broke a small biscuit in half, offering one piece to Bear, who accepted it gently, saving the other for later. For a moment the station existed in perfect balance. Snow falling, lights glowing, a man waiting, a woman and her dog sharing a quiet Christmas ritual. Ryan allowed himself to believe the stillness might hold, unaware that approaching footsteps, too fast, too sharp for the hour, had already begun to cut through the hush of the snowfall. Ethan Walker emerged from the curtain of falling snow with a stride too fast for the quiet hour, his shoes striking the concrete in sharp, uneven rhythms that cut through the stillness of the platform. In his early 30s, he was slightly shorter than Ryan, but broader through the shoulders, his build once athletic and now softened by stress rather than comfort. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, pushed back carelessly from his forehead, already damp with melting snow and sweat, while a short, untrimmed beard clung to his jaw, giving him the look of a man who had stopped caring how he appeared. His face was drawn tight, eyes bloodshot and restless, darting from the station entrance to the surrounding benches as if expecting someone to be watching him. The coat he wore was expensive but worn, its creased fabric suggesting a man who had once lived better than he did now, with desperation clinging to him more visibly than the snow. Claire stiffened the moment she saw him. The calm that had settled over her only minutes earlier retreated, replaced by guarded tension that straightened her spine and tightened her grip on the armrest of her wheelchair. Ethan slowed as he approached, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes, his breath leaving him in short, visible bursts. He said her name softly, almost pleading, then stepped into her space without waiting for permission, pulling a folded stack of papers from inside his coat. His hands shook as he laid them across the small tray attached to her chair, the edges fluttering in the cold air while he spoke quickly, insisting this was the last time, the final solution, a simple signature that would make everything right again. Bear rose slowly to his feet, joints stiff but purpose unwavering, placing himself directly in front of Claire, with his broad chest squared toward Ethan and his head lowered just enough to signal warning. A low sound rumbled from his throat, not a snarl but a reminder. Ethan flinched, irritation flashing across his face before he forced it down. Claire shook her head, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it, and said no. She reminded him of their mother, of the promise made in a hospital room heavy with antiseptic and finality that the house would never be used as collateral or gambled away. Ethan's jaw clenched as he leaned closer, lowering his voice further, speaking of debt, of time running out, of people who were less patient than she was, each word carrying an edge that contradicted his claim of negotiation. From his bench, Ryan watched without appearing to. His body remained relaxed, posture unchanged, but his attention sharpened with instinctive clarity as he noted the way Ethan's hands hovered too close to Claire's shoulders and how his weight shifted forward, crowding her. He caught the flicker of contempt when the dog moved and the impatience behind the forced civility. This was not a man seeking help. It was a man applying pressure. Ryan recognized the pattern immediately, the escalation hidden beneath pleading language. His pulse slowed as his focus narrowed, and he waited, knowing situations like this revealed their truth if given enough rope. Ethan straightened abruptly, frustration cracking through his thin restraint as he gestured at the papers, his voice rising just enough to draw glances from a few remaining passengers. He accused Claire of being unreasonable, of forgetting everything he had done for her. Claire's eyes hardened as she reminded him quietly of everything she had already given, money, time, excuses, and that her life had already been reduced once, that she would not let it be taken again, piece by piece. Bear held his ground, muscles taut beneath aging fur, eyes locked on Ethan's hands as snow gathered on their coats and shoulders, the cold indifferent to the conflict unfolding beneath it. Ethan's gaze flicked across the platform and landed on Ryan for the first time. Their eyes met briefly. Ethan saw only a quiet stranger with a cup of coffee, nothing remarkable at all, while Ryan saw a man cornered by his own choices, volatile and unpredictable, measuring how far he could push before consequences arrived. Ethan dismissed him and leaned back toward Claire, lowering his voice again as the promise of this being the last time slipped into implied threats, cloaked as concern. Bear's growl deepened, and Claire's hands trembled despite her resolve. The station loudspeaker crackled faintly in the background, announcing nothing of importance, but the sound seemed to break something fragile in the air. Ethan exhaled hard, raking a hand through his hair before shoving the papers closer to Claire with unnecessary force and telling her to think about it. He stepped back half a pace, arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes fixed on her as if daring her to refuse again. Snow continued to fall thick and unrelenting, settling over the platform like a shroud, while Ryan shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, setting his coffee down beside him. He did not move toward them, but something in his posture changed, a subtle readiness that had not been there before, as he understood with certainty that Ethan had not come to ask. He had come to take, and whatever followed would no longer remain a private family matter. Ethan's restraint finally fractured under the weight of refusal. The words Claire had spoken, calm, final, immovable, landed on him not as boundaries but as an insult he could no longer endure. His face tightened, jaw locking as something volatile took hold behind his eyes. In one sudden motion, too fast for reason to intervene, he reached for the wheelchair, gripping the handle and the armrest with shaking hands. The movement was clumsy but violent, driven by panic rather than precision. The chair tipped sideways, metal scraping against concrete, and Claire was thrown into the snow, the cold biting instantly through her coat as she landed hard and disoriented, breath knocked from her chest. The world seemed to pause for a fraction of a second, as if the falling snow itself hesitated. Claire's shock broke into sound, a sharp, frightened cry that cut through the quiet station. Before Ethan could step back or reconsider, Bear surged forward. Age slowed him, but instinct did not. He lunged with a hoarse, protective growl, teeth catching Ethan's forearm through layers of fabric. It was not an attack meant to punish, only to stop, to create space between threat and the woman he guarded. Ethan shouted in pain and surprise, stumbling backward as he shook his arm, fury overtaking fear in an instant. He reacted without thought, without restraint. Drawing back his leg, he kicked at the dog with full force. The blow landed hard against Bear's side, the impact sending the old German shepherd crashing onto the snow with a sound that carried too far in the stillness. Bear yelped, a sharp, broken sound of pain and confusion, his body curling inward as he tried to rise and failed. The snow around him darkened with disturbed slush as his paws scrabbled weakly against the ground. Claire screamed his name, crawling toward him on numb hands, panic flooding her voice as she reached for the dog's fur. Across the platform, Ryan Walker stood up. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. The stillness he had carried for the past hour dropped away, replaced by movement that was controlled and purposeful. His body shifted as if responding to a signal only he could hear. Years of discipline stripped away emotion, leaving clarity. This was no longer an argument, no longer a family dispute unfolding in public. A defenseless woman had been thrown to the ground. An animal protecting her had been deliberately harmed. The line that separated tension from violence had been crossed, and Ryan recognized it with absolute certainty. He closed the distance quickly, his steps measured and efficient, eyes locked on Ethan's center of mass. Ethan, consumed by rage, barely registered the approach until Ryan was already within arm's reach. The confrontation ended almost as soon as it began. Ryan caught Ethan's wrist as he raised his foot again, twisting it downward in a controlled arc that forced him off balance. At the same time, Ryan stepped in close, placing his shoulder against Ethan's chest and redirecting his momentum toward the ground. There was no wild struggle, no unnecessary force, just precise, practiced movement that left Ethan sprawled on the concrete, breath knocked loose and arm pinned in a position that made resistance pointless. The remaining passengers recoiled, some gasping, others frozen in place. Snow continued to fall, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Ryan remained calm, his grip firm but controlled, his voice low and even as he issued simple instructions for Ethan to stay still. Ethan cursed and struggled briefly, but pain and shock quickly drained the fight from him. On the ground nearby, Claire clutched Bear's head, her hands trembling as she pressed her forehead against his fur, whispering to him through tears. Bear whined softly, breathing shallow but steady, his tail giving a weak, reassuring twitch in response to her touch. Distant sirens began to cut through the night, faint at first, and then clearer, echoing off the station walls. Ryan did not look toward the sound. He kept his focus where it belonged, maintaining control until authority arrived. When the first police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing against the snow, officers moved in cautiously, weapons holstered but alert. They took in the scene quickly: the overturned wheelchair, the injured dog, the man restrained on the ground by a stranger who showed no signs of panic. Ryan complied without protest as they took over, stepping back slowly, hands visible, his expression unreadable. As medics arrived and knelt beside Claire and Bear, the reality of what had happened began to settle over the platform. Ethan was hauled to his feet, anger replaced by sullen disbelief as cuffs snapped around his wrists. Claire watched him being led away, her face pale and drawn, one hand still resting protectively on Bear's neck. Ryan stood a few steps back beneath the station lights, snow gathering silently on his shoulders once more. He had not acted out of anger or obligation, and he felt no triumph in the outcome. He had acted because there were moments when doing nothing was no longer an option, and this had been one of them. As the sirens faded and the station filled with quiet again, Ryan understood that whatever followed would reach far beyond this night. The platform no longer felt like a place of waiting. It had become a scene marked by aftermath, footprints scuffed into slush, the wheelchair lying on its side, and the faint metallic tang of adrenaline lingering in the air. Ryan Walker stood a short distance away as officers separated him from Ethan, his hands relaxed at his sides, posture neutral, expression unreadable. He answered questions simply, offering no more than what was necessary. He gave his name, stated that he intervened because someone was in danger, and said nothing about where he had learned to move the way he did. To the officers, he was just another bystander who had acted when things went too far. Officer Mark Reed took charge of the scene. Reed was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered with a thick neck and a face permanently set in a weary frown, the kind earned through years of responding to situations that rarely resolved cleanly. His dark hair was cropped short beneath his cap, and a heavy mustache framed a mouth that spoke more often in sighs than words. He listened carefully, nodding as Ryan spoke, his eyes flicking briefly toward Ethan, now subdued and cuffed, before returning to Claire and the injured dog. Reed's tone was professional but cautious, shaped by experience with domestic disputes that often spiraled into legal gray zones. When he spoke, it was with the measured cadence of someone already weighing how this would look on paper. Paramedics knelt beside Claire and Bear, their movements calm and practiced. One of them, a woman named Sarah Mills, appeared to be in her early 30s, tall and slim with sandy blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. Her pale skin was flushed from the cold, freckles standing out against her cheeks as she worked. Her voice was steady and reassuring, even as she examined Bear's ribs and checked Claire for injuries. Sarah spoke softly, explaining each step before she did it, the mark of someone who understood that control over information could be as comforting as physical care. Bear whimpered when touched, but he did not snap or resist, his trust in humans unbroken despite the pain. Ethan was lifted to his feet and led toward the cruiser, his earlier fury drained into sullen disbelief. He protested weakly, insisting it was a family matter, that things had gotten out of hand, that he hadn't meant for any of it to happen. Officer Reed listened without engaging, his jaw tightening slightly. In the end, Ethan was taken away with minimal ceremony, charged but not condemned, the language used deliberately neutral. Ryan caught the phrasing, the way assault softened into domestic altercation, and he understood immediately what it meant. This would not end tonight. Not really. Claire was helped onto a stretcher, her face pale but composed, her eyes never leaving Bear as he was carefully lifted onto a separate gurney. She thanked the paramedics quietly, her voice thin but steady. When she finally looked toward Ryan, her gaze held gratitude mixed with confusion, as if she were trying to understand how a stranger had stepped into a moment that had defined her life for years. Ryan met her eyes briefly and nodded once, offering no explanation, no reassurance beyond his presence. He did not follow them into the ambulance. He stayed where he was, watching until the doors closed and the vehicle disappeared into the falling snow. As the platform emptied and the last of the officers began to pack up, Officer Reed approached Ryan again. This time his tone shifted, dropping its official edge. He thanked Ryan for stepping in, but followed it with a familiar warning, advising him not to get involved further, reminding him that family situations were complicated, that things often looked worse from the outside. Ryan listened without argument, his face calm, his response polite. He said he understood. Reed seemed satisfied, or perhaps relieved, and moved on, unaware that his words had confirmed what Ryan already suspected. The station grew quiet once more. Snow continued to fall, indifferent to what had unfolded beneath it. Ryan remained under the yellow glow of the platform lights, his train long forgotten, his coffee untouched where he had left it. He felt the familiar pull to leave, to return to anonymity, to let systems take their course as they always did. But images replayed unbidden, the way Ethan's hands had shaken with rage, the sound of Bear's cry, the look in Claire's eyes as she lay on the snow. Ryan knew that what had happened tonight was not an isolated explosion, but part of a longer pattern, one that would resume the moment attention faded. He could board the next train and disappear. No one would stop him. No one would question it. But as he stood there, snow settling quietly on his coat, Ryan made a decision that felt heavier than any order he had ever followed. He picked up his coffee, now cold beyond saving, and set it aside. He turned away from the tracks and toward the exit instead, not with urgency, but with resolve. Whatever came next, he would not leave it to chance. Not this time. Not. Ethan was released less than 24 hours after his arrest, the paperwork moving faster than the snowplows clearing the roads. The explanation was brief and bloodless, insufficient evidence of intent, mitigating circumstances, family dispute. By the time Claire returned home from the hospital on Christmas Eve, her body aching and her nerves still raw, the town had already begun to settle back into its holiday routine, lights glowing warmly in windows as if nothing had happened. The cold followed her into the driveway, biting through her coat as she stopped short, the sight in front of her stealing what little breath she had left. Her car sat where she had left it, but it no longer looked like a refuge. One headlight was shattered, glass scattered across the snow like frozen tears. The driver's side door bore deep scratches, jagged and angry, cut through paint down to bare metal. Across the windshield, written in thick, uneven strokes, was a single word smeared into the frost. Pay. Claire felt the meaning settle into her chest like a weight. This was not vandalism for its own sake. It was a message, deliberate and personal. Bear, still bandaged and sore, let out a low, unsettled whine from the back seat, his body tense as if he sensed the danger before she fully understood it. Ryan arrived moments later, having followed at a distance he hoped would not feel intrusive. He took in the damage silently, eyes moving from the car to the door of the house, noting the scrape marks along the frame where something sharp had been dragged downward. His face remained calm, but his jaw tightened. This was escalation, clean and unmistakable. He did not ask who had done it. They both knew. He helped Claire inside, moving carefully, mindful of Bear's injuries, and once the door was locked behind them, the house felt smaller, its walls suddenly inadequate against what waited outside. The neighbor across the street, Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, appeared at her window, then at her door, curiosity and concern pulling her out into the cold. She was in her late 60s, short and sturdy, her silver hair pulled back into a practical bun beneath a wool hat. Years of Montana winters had etched lines into her face, but her eyes were sharp and observant. She took in the scene quickly, her gaze lingering on Ryan. There was recognition there, not of his face, but of his posture, the way he stood slightly angled, alert without appearing tense. "You're military," she said quietly, not as a question. Ryan did not confirm it, but he did not deny it either. Mrs. Thompson nodded once, as if that explained more than words could. Officer Reed arrived again not long after, his cruiser lights washing the snow in red and blue. He surveyed the damage with a weary expression, hands resting on his belt. His report was thorough, his tone sympathetic, but his conclusion was the same. Without witnesses, without direct evidence tying Ethan to the vandalism, there was little he could do, beyond documenting the incident. "Family matters like this," he said gently, avoiding Ryan's eyes. "They tend to cool off on their own." The words landed heavily. Claire nodded numbly, her faith in reassurance long spent. Ryan listened in silence, noting the finality in Reed's voice, the quiet suggestion that no further protection would come from this direction. After the cruiser pulled away, the street fell quiet again, Christmas lights blinking in practiced cheer. Inside the house, Claire sat wrapped in a blanket, Bear resting at her feet, his breathing shallow but steady. Ryan stood near the window, watching the snowfall erase footprints, erase evidence, erase urgency. He understood now what the system would not say aloud. Until something worse happened, nothing would change. The message on the windshield was not the end. It was an opening move. Ethan had tested the boundary and found it flexible. Ryan considered leaving just once more. He told himself he had done enough, that staying would only entangle him further. But the image of Claire discovering the damage alone, of Bear trying to rise on injured legs to protect her again, would not release him. This was no longer about intervention in a single moment. It was about what came after, when attention faded and patterns resumed. Ryan felt the familiar shift inside him, the quiet acceptance of responsibility that came not from obligation, but from choice. That night, as Claire slept fitfully and the town settled into uneasy calm, Ryan made his decision concrete. He walked the perimeter of the house, memorizing angles, noting blind spots, testing locks and lights. He said nothing of what he planned, offering Claire only reassurance that he would be nearby. Snow continued to fall, softening the world, but beneath its cover, something else was taking shape. Christmas had come and gone, and peace had not followed it. Ryan understood now that if he stepped away, the space he left would be filled by fear. He chose instead to stay, not as a savior, not as a soldier, but as a barrier between what had already happened and what threatened to come next. Ryan did not announce his decision to stay. He simply acted on it. By daylight, the house looked unchanged, an ordinary place on an ordinary street, but by nightfall it had become something else entirely. Ryan moved through the space with quiet precision, installing small cameras beneath eaves and near entry points, choosing angles that covered blind spots without drawing attention. He placed audio recorders where voices would carry clearly, tested connections twice, and memorized timings. There was no anger in his movements, no sense of revenge. This was patience, measured and deliberate, shaped by years of learning that the most effective response to chaos was preparation. Claire watched him work from the living room, wrapped in a blanket, Bear lying beside her with his bandaged ribs rising and falling steadily. Bear was 8 years old now, past his prime, but not his purpose. His once powerful frame had softened, yet his eyes remained sharp, following Ryan as he moved, recognizing intention even without command. The dog no longer stood guard at the door. Pain made that impossible. Instead, he stayed close to Claire, placing his body between her and the windows, ears twitching at every distant sound. Claire said little, but her tension eased slightly as the night deepened, reassured not by promises, but by presence. Snow fell harder after midnight, thick enough to blur the streetlights and muffle distant noise. Ryan took position near the back window, lights off, his outline hidden in shadow. He did not pace. He did not watch the cameras constantly. He listened. When the sound came, it was exactly as he expected. Footsteps crunching too heavily through snow meant to conceal them, a shape emerging at the edge of the yard with no attempt at subtlety. Ethan did not arrive quietly. Rage had replaced caution, and alcohol dulled whatever restraint he might once have had. His coat hung open, hair plastered to his forehead, beard darker with melted snow. Ethan reached the porch and began pounding on the door, each blow echoing through the house. He shouted Claire's name, his voice slurred but loud, weaving threats with twisted declarations of concern. He accused, demanded, promised consequences. The words spilled freely now, unfiltered and reckless. Ryan remained still as the cameras captured everything, the distorted face, the raised fist, the threats spoken clearly enough to stand on their own. Inside, Claire pressed her hand over her mouth to silence herself, tears streaking down her face as Bear growled weakly, his body trembling with the urge to rise and defend. Ethan kicked the door once, twice, then turned toward the window, pointing as he shouted, making sure his message was heard. Ryan watched without intervening. This was not the moment for confrontation. This was the moment for proof. Eventually, frustration overcame stamina. Ethan staggered back into the snow, shouting one final promise of what would happen next, before disappearing into the darkness he had come from. Only when the yard was empty again did Ryan move, checking locks, reassuring Claire with a few quiet words, his voice steady and controlled. By morning, Ryan had compiled everything: video, audio, timestamps, documentation of prior reports, medical records of Bear's injuries, photos of the vandalism. He did not take it to Officer Reed. He already knew how that conversation would end. Instead, he sent the files directly to the county prosecutor's office, bypassing the familiar walls that softened accountability. He included a clear, concise statement and nothing more. Facts did not need emotion to be effective. When the confirmation receipt arrived, Ryan felt no satisfaction, only certainty. The process had begun. As dawn broke, pale light reflecting off untouched snow, the house felt different. Not safe, not yet, but no longer helpless. Claire sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug she had barely touched, Bear resting his head against her leg. Ryan stood by the window, watching the street come back to life, aware that the quiet would not last. But he also knew that this time the night had left evidence behind. The wheel had started turning, slow but unstoppable, and for the first time since this began, the outcome was no longer controlled by fear. The arrest came quietly, without spectacle. 2 unmarked vehicles arrived just after dawn, their tires crunching softly against fresh snow that no longer fell from the sky. Ethan Walker was taken into custody again, this time without raised voices or confusion, the weight of documented threats and recorded evidence leaving no room for reinterpretation. The charges were no longer softened by language or circumstance. They were specific, criminal, and unmistakable. No one called it a family dispute anymore. It was what it had always been, finally named aloud. Claire watched from the living room window as officers escorted her brother away. Her hands trembled slightly, but her expression was steady, almost distant, as if she were witnessing the end of a chapter she had already mourned. Legal protection followed swiftly, restraining orders, formal charges, guarantees that did not rely on goodwill. For the first time in years, the house did not feel like borrowed ground. It belonged to her again, not because someone promised it would, but because the law now stood where fear once had. Bear recovered slowly. His ribs healed at their own pace, and his steps were careful, measured, no longer carrying the effortless strength they once had. Yet every morning, without fail, he positioned himself beside Claire's wheelchair as she moved through the house, his body angled outward, his presence constant. Age had taken speed and power from him, but it had not taken purpose. In the quiet light of Christmas morning, his tail thumped softly against the floor, a small, stubborn affirmation that he was still where he was meant to be. The snow stopped falling before noon, leaving the town hushed beneath a pale winter sky. Ryan stood outside near his truck, his bag packed, the engine idling quietly. He had already said his goodbyes in his own way, fixing a loose hinge on the back door, leaving a list of contacts Claire might need, making sure the cameras were removed and nothing remained that would keep her looking over her shoulder. He did not linger. He never did. Staying past the moment of resolution felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. Claire wheeled herself onto the porch as Ryan turned to leave. Her voice shook when she spoke his name, not loud enough to stop him, but enough to make him pause. She asked the question that had waited behind every thank you and every look of confusion since the night at the station. Why had he helped her? Why had a stranger chosen to stay when even family had failed? Ryan considered the question for a moment, his face thoughtful, eyes reflecting the winter light. "There are times," he said finally, his voice calm and unadorned, "when a stranger has to do what family won't." There was no bitterness in the words, no judgment, only acceptance. Claire nodded, understanding settling over her like warmth. She did not try to stop him again. She simply watched as he walked away, his figure growing smaller against the quiet street until distance claimed him. By afternoon, Christmas returned to the house in small, honest ways. Light filtered through the windows. Bear slept in the sun. Claire brewed coffee and let it cool untouched, smiling faintly at the stillness. Outside, the town moved on, unaware of how close fear had come, unaware of the line that had been crossed and redrawn. Ryan Walker left without ceremony, without thanks demanded or expected, leaving behind not a miracle, but something steadier, a season reclaimed, and a Christmas morning no longer ruled by fear. Sometimes miracles don't come as thunder from the sky. They come as a stranger who chooses to stay. God often works quietly, through kindness, courage, and ordinary people who listen to their hearts. This story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone. In daily life, a small act of compassion can be someone else's miracle. And if you're the one waiting for help, remember, God sees you, and He has not forgotten you. May God bless you, protect your home, and bring peace to your heart. If this story touched you, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing stories that heal and inspire. God bless you.